if you believe, as they do and as I do, that the Biden administration, spent $20 billion arming Israel to commit what the world's human rights organizations and Israel's own human rights organization, B'Tselem, have said is a genocide. Um, and that it did so even though there was ample evidence, it seems to people like me, that it was involved in grave crimes. I mean, as you know, Josh Paul at the State Department resigns in October 2023, saying we're violating U.S. law by sending these weapons. They're going to be used to terrible effect. The International Court of Justice says in January 2024 that there's a plausible case that Israel's committing genocide. In that spring, the ICC convicts Netanyahu for war crimes, and yet the weapons still keep flowing in Israel. And so is it wrong to think that there should be some kind of personal accountability when you think about all of the people who were killed by those weapons, to say that people who were involved in that policy shouldn't be involved in government again? What's wrong with that perspective?
Well, there's a lot there, and I'm sure we'll get into the substance of that. I don't necessarily agree on the framing of that, but that's fine. Just on the personnel question, I think, look, that may happen, right? A future president may decide that they, don't want certain people. They have their own people. Of course, that would be very normal. And that's not particularly sort of new or novel, right? And generally speaking, at very senior levels, you don't have people coming back, right? I think so. That person, whoever the nominee is, he or she will decide on who they want. I guess what I'm sort of pushing back against is the idea that as a starting point in a conversation, right? It's about, that the starting point is a certain number of people should be disqualified from partaking in that discussion, that there should be a general sort of rejection of an overall approach, just to say that's a restorationist approach or something, and then we'll just figure out the details later. I think my point is, like, let's try to figure out the details now, right? And some of the people who are often mentioned in this, they did actually, develop a more novel, like, foreign policy approach on other issues, very significant issues, including China and the global economy and other things, that I think before we reject those ideas and that policy, like, we should talk about it, right? We should talk about what that policy was accurately, and we should talk about what the alternatives are. And there should be a debate and discussion. And look, I think the Democratic Party needs a massive, debate and a huge contest. And my view is everyone should run, right? And I think everyone should weigh in on the foreign policy questions. And I think also for those who have not been, like AOC and others who maybe are slightly, newer to sort of foreign policy than some people who have been in it a long time, we should give them time to develop their ideas, right? We shouldn't be, right off the bat sort of trying to ask people the most impossible questions. They need to have sort of time and space to do that, and we need to be, sort of, not understanding is the wrong word, but we need to be very welcoming of giving people the opportunity to do that, right? So that's my sort of view in it. So I just think that this sort of, this sort of idea that we've seen a little bit from certain sort of quarters, that's more very focused on that litmus test idea, to me, I think is not really realistic, because there will be a debate, right? And everyone is free to participate in that because it's a democracy, and B, like, the outcome on the personnel side will totally depend on who actually convinces voters and wins the election, right? And if a future president decides they want to appoint someone from the Biden administration, then they'll have a mandate to do that. And if they decide they don't want to do that and they want to go with, a very, let's say, progressive bench or people who've never served before, then they're totally free and will have a mandate to do that too. So, so I just want to get more to I don't mean you and me, I mean in the
Sure.
general discussion. I think and that's what I was trying to do with the piece, was to say, like, let's actually, because I think there are real substantive differences. That's the thing. Like, these are profoundly important, and I think there's lots of critiques on each side of the other, but what our affirmative options and proposals are, I think, is something that maybe is a little underdeveloped on both sides, actually.
I agree, and I do want to talk about those, but just one more on this. It does seem to me that a lot does depend um, on how one evaluates the Biden administration's policy, particularly
Yeah.
as it relates to Gaza. I mean, because I think we could probably agree that there are certain U.S. foreign policy decisions that were so catastrophic. Let's say Vietnam, that the idea of bringing Walt Rostow or George Bundy or Robin McNamara or people like back into government, or Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, that we would say no, that these people have disqualified themselves because the policy was so catastrophic and immoral. And that is the way I see the Gaza policy. And I'm curious, do you see the Gaza is the Biden administration's policy as I do, as basically aiding and abetting a genocide?
No, I don't see it that way. I mean, I wouldn't, I know this is obviously a controversial issue, but I wouldn't use the term, genocide. To me, Israel's sort of focus was on defeating Hamas. It was very excessive in how it went about doing that. I think there are certainly questions about war crimes being committed, particularly on, the use of starvation and food in a weaponized sort of form. And so I think there's lots of very significant issues there, but I don't think that their intention, for the most part, particularly the sole intention part, was, to destroy the Palestinian people, in Gaza, right? And a sort of systematic killing in the way we would normally, think of a genocide. So, I wouldn't sort of go along with that. I know I think it is a debate on the, on the legal scholarly side and genocide studies about whether it constitutes that. I know there's been various votes and weighing in by different groups. There's also a question that's very sort of muddied on the legal issue, and in many ways, it is a legal question. And to me, I think I come down in a different sort of side of that, but I'm not a legal scholar. But I wouldn't go not to dodge your question. I wouldn't sort of frame it in that way.
But I mean, the International Association of Genocide Scholars have said it's a genocide. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, the UN, B'Tselem. I mean, if there were any other country in the world where there was this much of a consensus among genocide scholars and human rights organizations, do you really think that you would be questioning whether they were right?
Well, again, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I think there is a legal aspect to it in terms of, does it qualify under the Genocide Convention? My understanding is the divide amongst legal scholars and genocide scholars on that question is more divided than what you sort of laid out at the outset, because it gets into this question of sort of sole intention, and some of that I think has evolved over time in terms of their sort of understanding of it. So there's a question whether someone adheres to to like which definition or which sort of understanding one would, adhere to. But I think you can explain, just not defend, but explain a lot of what we've seen in terms of the excesses in going after sort of a total victory idea over Hamas, which I think was sort of unrealistic. And I think it's still sort of unrealistic in terms of how the Netanyahu government sort of defines it. And I think that, that is, you could certainly explain that as being their intention, and also that as being the effect. But I think, look, people will have and have obviously, sort of strong views on this, and many people like yourself will use that sort of term. But again, that would not be how I sort of think about it or frame it. And so, I mean, I'm happy to go into, I think,
Yeah.
just if it's helpful in terms of how I sort of saw it. And as I mentioned, I mean, I wasn't directly involved in Gaza policy or Middle East policy. I ran the strategic planning team at the NSC. We were a team of 6 or 7 people, depending. We did weigh in a bit at different points. After October 7th, we did have someone working on Middle East policy. They tended to be focused on sort of day after contingency plans. So we worked on that sort of thing. But I'm happy to tell you a little bit about just how it sort of looked from where I sat.